Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Crank It Tales. This is the podcast where we take different motorcycle related topics. It can be street bikes, dirt bikes, rallies, whatever it is. If it's cool and it's two wheels related, we are probably gonna cover it. And today's topic is gonna be a bit of a sort of a blast from the past. We're gonna look at the true monster, at the true Italian monster, to be even more specific. But in order to do this, let's come back to our current days, right? Let's come back to 2020. And the Ducati unveiled a pretty monstrous motorcycle. I'm talking about the Streetfighter V4. Basically what Ducati did was they took their superbike, their flagship superbike, the Panigale V4, stole that engine and some other bits off of that, and made it a naked. They even gave it wings. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen another bike that has wings on the sides. How useful they are, that's a completely different question and topic. But it is a bonkers machine because just for some quick stats, it has about more than 200 horsepower. I think it's 210 or 220 brake horsepower. That's amazing for not just for a naked motorcycle, for a motorcycle, whatever motorcycle. It's just bonkers. Has a lot of electronics. It has a lot of trick suspension, brakes. Everything on it is really cool. Well, except for the price tags, it's really, really expensive. And that made me think, what else can we do? I want a piece of Italiana because, hey, I mean, when you see this red bike with like dark or gold accents, they look really cool. Let's be honest. Ducatis look really cool. They sound amazing, and even the old ones do sound amazing. But I don't want to spend that kind of money. And so, by looking here and there, I realized that there is a motorcycle that Ducati made that not many people know about. But I might argue that it's way more bonkers even than the current Ducati Streetfighter, than the current V4. And I'll hold my plea for this bike. So the reason why I started this podcast talking about the current Streetfighter V4 is because I think that one of the most bonkers and mad motorcycles of all times was actually the V4's father. I'm talking about the Ducati Streetfighter. That's it. It had no other name. It was the Ducati Streetfighter, and if you really want to take it sort of engine coding, it's the Streetfighter 1100 and the 1100S versions. These bikes basically followed this sort of same recipe that the current bikes do. Take the engine from their superbike, take some parts of the chassis and brakes and really cool and trick suspension, put them on a naked bike and let it go. And it kind of worked. So just to go a bit through some specifications of this motorcycle, because I want to get them out of the way, but there are some specifications that are really impressive. So first of all, this bike was launched in 2009. So basically its run was between 2009 and 2012. So it's not an old bike, I would argue, but neither is it state of the art, right? So since 10 years ago, bikes evolved a lot and we have a lot more things happening with bikes these days. This was not the case with the Streetfighter, and the Streetfighter was sort of one of the last of its kind. And this is why I think it's so amazing in any way, shape, or form. But going back to some specifications, right? Of course, it's got 6-speed gearbox and blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go over the boring stuff, but I think there are two important figures we need to focus on. First of all, the weight. So the dry weight was 167 kilograms, and with like a full tank, with oil in it, antifreeze, and coolant, stuff like that, the bike would end up being around 197 kilograms. Or if you're from the US, that's about 434 pounds. Under 200 kilograms for a bike is already pretty good. I'm talking for a bike with a full tank. But the most amazing thing about this one is the engine, the drivetrain combination in general. First of all, its engine was a twin, and a classic Ducati L twin, so you get its classic sound. And it produced 155 horsepower at 9,500 RPM. 155 horsepower for a bike that came out in 2009 is absolutely amazing. And let me rephrase that. You get this power on a naked bike from that era. That's something out of this world. You get 119 Newton meters of torque, or 87 foot-pounds. And you get the classic Ducati dry clutch. Now, you can love it or hate it. If you don't know what a dry clutch is or what's the big deal about it, basically most motorcycle clutches are live in a bath of oil, and they don't really sound. But Ducati used dry clutches. I think they said it was for performance reasons. But one of the drawbacks one might say about these types of clutches were that, well, they are loud and they do sound like the bike is actually kind of broken. It's a bit funny when someone doesn't know how a dry clutch sounds and then you first power on your bike. But this engine configuration is pretty iconic for Ducati. The classic good old L twin has a lot of torque down low, had some amazing sounds up high in the rev range. The dry clutch was something else. I mean, look, if you want something ordinary, go buy a Z1000 or a Yamaha R1 or whatever. This is not the point of this bike. This bike is different. But we haven't got to the part where this bike shows its true nature and the fact that it's an animal. So remember I said about the figure of 155 horsepower? Well, the catch is that this thing has absolutely no electronic aids. Nothing. It didn't have ABS, it didn't have traction control, nothing. It's just you, your right wrist, and the brake levers, and that's it. You are in charge of 155 horsepower on a naked bike, on an upright position. In 2009. This is something that at the time was just unheard of. Of course, what was unheard of was also the amount of money that you needed in order to purchase such a car, such a bike. I mean, Ducatis have never been cheap, and such a flagship Ducati isn't cheap either. The thing is, this bike, I think it came at a time that nakeds just weren't that popular. I mean, look, this bike sounds amazing, behaves amazing, handles amazing. That engine, I can probably have wet dreams with it in my sleep. But it came at a time where these sort of hyper nakeds weren't really a thing yet. I mean, sure, there was the Aprilia Tuono, there was the KTM, the 990 Super Duke R, and yes, they were super nakeds, but they weren't hyper nakeds as we know them these days, and it's really something different. I truly think that the Streetfighter might have been the first hyper naked, where it's so exotic, so mad, no electronics. It was something else. And that's without even going into the looks of this bike, which in my opinion is one of the most beautiful bikes out there. So one of the first things that's really like iconic for Ducati that they introduced on this bike was the design of it and their trellis frame. So if you don't really know what a trellis frame is, so if you think about most of the motorcycles you see out on the streets these days, they have these sort of fluid frames, right? Ducati, up until lately, have used trellis frames, which are basically frames that are built out of tubes. They might appear to be more rudimentary, but tuned the right way, they can really be something else. And this was exactly the sort of philosophy behind the Streetfighter. Ducati went all in with their parts, with their engines, and they built a bike that was just astounding from almost every point of view. And to give you an idea, if you go on MCN, they do have a review of it from 2009, and they gave it 4 stars out of 5. The biggest downsides were the value and reliability. But the engine, ride quality, and brakings all got really good grades, and the owner's rating on the same website was 4.7. That is, I would argue, pretty cool. Look, we can sit here and talk about specs and reviews all day about this Ducati, and unfortunately with bikes like these, you can't really talk about them well in a podcast. You have to ride them, to test them out, to see them, to feel them. This is how these bikes should be enjoyed, out on the street, where you hear all the clunks, you hear all the sounds, the noises, everything this bike can produce, you hear it. That's the really interesting part of a motorcycle like the Ducati Streetfighter. I mean, sure, I'm sitting here in my home recording this podcast, and I'm really looking all over the place for a bike like this. And here comes the issue with buying one of these days. They're really rare. Ducati hasn't sold a lot of them, and to be honest, yeah, the price was probably one of the reasons. But at the end of the day, Ducati didn't sell many, and what this means is that even today on the used market, you don't find many of these bikes. I mean, if I go now on my classifieds in my country, I can only find one example. One. That's mad. Even if you go into their hometown, I mean home country in Italy, yes, you'll find more of them there, but at the end of the day, you won't find many. Not at all. It's a pretty rare bike, and it is a really special bike, and I think it's really the last of its kind. It's one of the last Ducati bikes to feature a dry clutch, which was an iconic feature of these bikes. It's the last Streetfighter to feature their V-twin engine, or the L-twin if you're a hardcore Ducatista. It's one of the last bikes that will probably have like a trellis frame, and more important than all of these things, it's one of the last bikes that will feel incredibly raw. Because of no traction control, no ABS, there's nothing to save you. You are the only thing that can save yourself. And I mean, take all of that and package it with some beautiful Ducati styling, a single-sided swing arm, and put some terminiones on there on the back side of the bike, and you have one heck of a bike. To be honest, I'm kind of struggling to find a bike that's just as special as this one without being a special edition. Because look, the Streetfighter, the 1100 Streetfighter, or the 1098 Streetfighter, however you want to call it, it wasn't supposed to be a special edition, right? It wasn't supposed to be like this limited edition motorcycle made by Ducati. It was meant to sell like any other bike. And the reason it didn't do as well, that can be discussed separately. But at the end of the day, what Ducati gave us was one of the most amazing motorcycles out there. And I hate to repeat it, but these days you will not find a bike with an engine like that and with no rider rate, really. No traction control, no ABS, no wheelie control, nothing. I think that the 2010 was like 2010, 11, 12, 13 even, or basically between like 04 and 2012. It was a time when motorcycle manufacturer could really go wild. Sure, emissions were starting to creep in, but nowhere near as much as they are these days. And these manufacturers could really go wild, and as a result, we got a lot of wild motorcycles. We got the Streetfighter, we got KTM's 990 Super Duke R, which actually was a single-seater. You couldn't carry a passenger side. There wasn't a passenger seat. I mean, even Super Sports had it, but not that KTM. It was a time when bikes were interesting. I'm not saying that they aren't now, but unfortunately now, because of the sort of current situation in the world, and I'm not talking about the virus, but because of all the emission restrictions and safety ratings and yada, 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 there are a lot of limitations that are being imposed on manufacturers, and bikes are never going to be the same. And I don't want to sound like that old person who gets stuck on the past. And I'm not. Like, I love modern day bikes. I think they're amazing. They're just as bonkers as the old ones. But the bikes that were being built like 10 to 15 years ago just have something about them. They have a crazy factor that you really rarely see these days. There are still some bikes that you do get that crazy factor, but man, it's sort of like comparing it with supercars from the past, right? I mean, in the 90s, Lamborghini did some mad supercars. They were wild. And then Audi bought them, or the VW group bought them, and they started to become reliable, and yeah, still cool, but just a tiny bit boring. I think you could argue something similar happened with bikes as well, and Ducati is actually a pretty good example of it, because Ducati is owned by Audi. And sure, their bikes got better, they're, like, objectively speaking, they are better, but I think they lost a bit of soul. That being said, current Ducati bikes, I think they're still absolutely amazing from almost every point of view. But I think it's worth it to shine a bit of a light on some older bikes, and on some bikes that you might easily glance over when you probably shouldn't. Because having a bike like this is going to be special, and when you're going to stop at a stoplight or whatever and you see other motorcyclists, the chance of you seeing another biker on something like this are almost null. And this is why this bike is so special. It sort of represents what Ducati made the name for in the last 20 years, and it's the pinnacle of that. It represents what Ducati could do, the most Ducati could do with an L-twin in a Streetfighter or in a naked bike form with dry clutches and things like that. It's old school, and that's why it's so cool. And it's adding to the coolness factor is that it's not only old school, but even up to by today's standards, it's a bonkers and incredibly powerful bike. And taking all of these things in consideration, I think this bike is absolutely amazing, and I would absolutely love to own one day. I'm looking on the classifieds, but man, it's really tough to find one. Thanks a lot for listening to this episode about the Ducati Streetfighter and the Streetfighter S, the 1098 or 1100 revision. This is a bike I'm really sort of passionate about, and I've looked at it for quite some time, and I will look at it in the future because I do truly want not only to ride one, but I want to own one. And I mean, I think that a lot of people don't know about this bike, and it's a bit of a shame because it's really a special bike from a lot of points of view, and it would be a shame if you're an enthusiast of motorcycles at least not to have heard about this bike. Thanks a lot for watching Crank It Tales, and I hope by next week we'll be able to get you the second episode of this show. We have multiple topics that we could go, off-road topics, rally topics, street bike topics. We will see. We will see whatever the inspiration comes. But for today, it's been all about Ducati, all about Italiano Vero. That being said, thanks a lot for listening to Cranking Tales, and yeah, see you on the next one. Bye.